It was not supposed to happen this way. For decades, the desktop world was seen as an entrenched battleground with two clear sides: Windows dominating consumers and businesses, and macOS reigning on high-end creative workstations. Linux was respected, revered in servers and cloud infrastructure, beloved by developers and enthusiasts, but always relegated to a niche corner of the computing landscape. The common narrative was that Linux on the desktop was a passion project, a technical playground, and a compelling alternative for a select few, but nothing close to a real competitor against the behemoth that is Microsoft. Yet here we are in 2026, and that story has quietly but unmistakably changed. In numbers that are startling when you piece them together, Linux desktops have overtaken Windows in many meaningful areas, from active daily usage statistics to enterprise deployments and cultural momentum. The first major shift happened slowly throughout the early 2020s and gathered steam like a train building up speed on a gradual incline. It was not a single moment, a sudden viral catalyst, or a dramatic announcement that everyone remembers. Instead, it was a series of seemingly small but cumulatively seismic shifts. Hardware manufacturers finally shipping quality Linux support out of the box. Applications that once were Windows exclusive arriving on Linux first or simultaneously. Open source communities collaborating with commercial vendors in ways once thought impossible. And a growing user frustration with the increasingly closed, rigid, and telemetry-heavy practices of mainstream proprietary systems, especially Windows. None of these developments alone would have been enough to tip the scales, but together, they reconfigured expectations and real-world behavior across millions of machines. What ultimately marked 2026 as the year Linux desktops won was not a single dramatic announcement from a tech giant, but rather the convergence of user behavior, market share data, and industry sentiment that could no longer be ignored. When analysts looked at quarterly desktop usage reports at the beginning of the year, they found that Linux distributions taken together exceeded Windows usage in key segments: developer environments, educational institutions, government offices in major regions, and even consumer personal machines in certain demographics. These were not fringe statistics from hobbyist forums or obscure trackers, but concrete indicators from mainstream analytics platforms, hardware OEM reports, and corporate deployment records. The numbers were unmistakable. Linux was no longer the underdog. It was often the majority choice. One of the most powerful drivers of this adoption has been the democratization of professional workflows. For years, critics said Linux could never replace Windows because of application compatibility, particularly in specialized software categories like video editing, CAD, gaming, and enterprise productivity suites. That narrative collapsed under its own weight as developers saw the enormous opportunity that the shifting tides created. Major open-source alternatives matured in quality and stability to the point where even demanding professionals began to treat them as first-class tools. At the same time, commercial software companies that once ignored the Linux desktop started releasing native Linux versions of their flagship products. Whether driven by market demand or necessity, companies realized that ignoring Linux was ignoring a significant and growing user base. Consider creative software, once the quintessential stronghold of proprietary platforms. Video editors, image manipulation tools, and 3D modeling applications on Linux have evolved dramatically. Powerful projects like DaVinci Resolve expanding support, Blender becoming a de facto industry standard across film and animation studios, and a vibrant ecosystem of plugins and performance enhancements made Linux a compelling choice for content creators. Users who once booted into Windows just to run Adobe software or proprietary design tools increasingly found that Linux alternatives were not just adequate but superior in certain workflows. Professional communities on Linux forums, Discord servers, and shared repositories became hubs of innovation, sharing tips, optimizations, and custom toolchains that further elevated user productivity. Gaming, long seen as the Achilles heel of Linux adoption beyond niche users, underwent its own renaissance. The introduction and rapid refinement of compatibility layers, particularly technologies like Proton and Wine matured by large teams with significant corporate sponsorship, transformed the Linux gaming landscape. Titles that were once exclusive to Windows began running with astonishing stability and performance on Linux systems. Meanwhile, native Linux releases of AA games grew in frequency as developers saw not just feasibility but benefit in supporting open platforms. Digital distribution platforms optimized their clients for Linux, Hardware manufacturers worked closely with driver developers, and performance benchmarks began showing Linux matching or even exceeding Windows in many gaming scenarios. Gamers who once hesitated to switch found themselves pleasantly surprised, and word of mouth spread. For the enterprise, the shift was equally profound. Corporations historically dependent on Windows and its ecosystem began evaluating alternatives as remote work. Security concerns and licensing costs took center stage in strategic planning. Linux offered a compelling total cost of ownership, combined with control over software environments that proprietary systems often could not match. IT departments found they could deploy standardized, secure Linux desktop environments across global teams without worrying about restrictive licensing fees or redundant service costs. Support ecosystems matured with professional vendors offering enterprise-grade support for popular desktop distributions, making the transition smoother than ever before. Throughout this transformation, the community angle of Linux played an unusual but decisive role. For many, Linux was always about more than just an operating system. It was about ownership, freedom, and transparency. In a world increasingly wary of opaque data practices and bundled telemetry, Linux's open-source ethos resonated deeply with users who wanted control over their computing environments. This philosophical alignment translated to practical advantages: vibrant communities offering documentation, collaborative troubleshooting, and a willingness to innovate in niche spaces that commercial entities often overlook. These communities became not just support networks, but engines of evangelism, encouraging adoption across demographic boundaries previously resistant to change. The educational sector, in particular, embraced Linux with remarkable enthusiasm. Schools and universities historically constrained by tight budgets found Linux distributions to be a godsend, powerful, free, customizable, and robust. Beyond budgetary relief, educators appreciated the opportunity to teach computing fundamentals without abstracting away core operating system concepts behind proprietary facades. Students learned real system administration, encountered open-source development practices early, and graduated with skills directly applicable to the kinds of infrastructures that power the modern internet. Governments in multiple regions began to standardize on Linux for public sector computing to improve security, reduce costs, and foster local technological ecosystems. This institutional backing further legitimized Linux in the eyes of individuals and businesses alike. At the same time, hardware compatibility, once a notorious sticking point for many would-be Linux adopters, improved drastically. Major manufacturers began shipping laptops, desktops, and even specialized workstations with Linux pre-installed, offering hardware support that rivaled or exceeded what Windows machines delivered. Graphics drivers, firmware support, power management, all areas that once required technical finesse to optimize on Linux, now worked smoothly out of the box for mainstream users. This shift owed much to collaborative efforts between open-source communities and hardware vendors who realized that embracing Linux could open new market segments rather than alienate existing ones. Cloud computing, long a domain where Linux reigned supreme in the backend, also played a role in the desktop's rise. As workflows increasingly migrated to browser-based applications and cloud-hosted services, the operating system became less of a gatekeeper and more of a gateway. Users who once felt tied to Windows because of specific software requirements found that their primary tools were accessible via the web or through cross-platform clients that ran seamlessly on Linux. The distinction between desktop and cloud blurred, and Linux emerged as a versatile, capable host for both local applications and cloud-centric workflows. Security concerns also contributed to Linux's ascent. In an era of escalating cyber threats, users and organizations became more vigilant about attack surfaces, data privacy, and system vulnerabilities. Linux's permission model, open review process, and rapid patch cycles gave it a perceived advantage over systems with closed-source stacks, where vulnerabilities may linger unnoticed for longer periods. While no system is invulnerable, the transparency and community-driven security practices around Linux inspired confidence among security professionals and cautious end users alike. Linux desktops became popular choices for sensitive environments in government, research, and finance, further validating the platform's reliability. Perhaps most importantly, the perception of Linux changed. For years, the mainstream mindset viewed Linux as the realm of programmers, tinkerers, and tech hobbyists, an interesting curiosity but not a real alternative for everyday computing. But as real users began to switch, the narrative shifted. Influencers, educators, and tech reviewers started documenting their experiences, offering Linux tutorials, troubleshooting guides, and comparative analyses that demystified the ecosystem for newcomers. Videos and blogs showcased how to migrate from Windows to Linux, how to set up familiar applications, and how to troubleshoot common issues. This content helped break down psychological barriers that once held back a generation of potential adopters. It wasn't flawless, and the transition was not without hiccups. Some legacy applications never made the journey to Linux, and while compatibility layers bridged many gaps, there were edge cases that required workarounds. Certain industry-specific tools still lagged behind their Windows counterparts, forcing hybrid environments where Linux coexisted with Windows virtual machines. But these were exceptions rather than the rule, and over time the momentum built around Linux created incentives for even those holdouts to reconsider their platforms. By 2026, the cultural momentum had become so pronounced that dismissing Linux as a fringe choice was no longer plausible. When people talked about desktop operating systems, they spoke of Windows, Mac OS, and Linux in the same breath. Market share reports from independent research firms started listing Linux ahead of Windows in global desktop usage percentages, particularly when mobile and embedded systems were excluded and the focus was strictly on traditional desktops and laptops. Consumer confidence grew as reliable data reinforced what many had already experienced firsthand. Linux was not only viable but often preferred. What, then, does this shift mean for the broader tech landscape? The implications are vast. Competition, long thought stagnant on the desktop front, has been reinvigorated. Users now have more leverage, more choice, and the ability to influence the direction of their tools rather than being constrained by monopolistic practices. Software vendors that once relied on closed ecosystems are rethinking how they build products, increasingly embracing cross-platform standards and open APIs. This has a ripple effect. Innovation accelerates, collaboration increases, and the pace of technological evolution quickens. For Microsoft, this reality has been challenging. Once the uncontested titan of desktop computing, the company has had to adapt its strategy in response to the marketplace. Rather than resisting the Linux surge, Microsoft has increasingly embraced open-source collaboration, contributing to projects that enhance interoperability and even releasing tools that run natively on Linux. It's a dramatic reversal from the early 2000s when open source was seen as a threat, not a partner. This evolution speaks to a broader recognition that the future of computing, desktop, cloud, and beyond, will be defined by openness and cooperation more than exclusivity and walled gardens. For users, the rise of Linux desktops has been profoundly empowering. People who once felt trapped by subscription fees, restrictive licensing, or opaque data practices found a viable alternative that respected user autonomy. Students learned computing fundamentals that gave them a deeper understanding of how their machines worked. Businesses found new efficiencies as they adopted flexible, cost-effective systems. Developers thrived in an environment that aligned with their values and allowed them to contribute meaningfully to tools they used every day. And everyday users discovered that Linux could be just as friendly, just as capable, and often more customizable than the operating systems they had used for years. As with any major shift, there are critics who argue that Linux hasn't won because Windows still holds certain advantages in specific niches or legacy environments. Others point out that Mac OS remains a dominant force in creative industries or that mobile platforms like Android and iOS far outstrip desktop usage overall. These critiques miss the larger picture. Victory in this context is not about absolute dominance in every metric, but about relevance, choice, and competitive parity. Linux has transcended its niche roots to become a first-class citizen in the desktop ecosystem. Looking forward, the trajectory suggests that the momentum behind Linux will continue to grow. Emerging technologies like augmented reality, edge computing, and decentralized platforms are being built with open-source principles at their core, and Linux desktops integrate naturally into this evolving landscape. Communities around Linux continue to innovate, driving advances in usability, performance, and cross-platform compatibility. As hardware evolves and software becomes ever more interconnected, Linux's flexibility and transparency position it well for future challenges and opportunities. In the end, the story of Linux quietly beating Windows on the desktop is not just about numbers or market share. It's about a shift in mindset, a reclamation of user agency, and a maturation of an ecosystem that was once dismissed as peripheral. It's about millions of individual choices that, when taken together, reshaped an industry. It's about the realization that technology can be both powerful and open, that users don't have to trade control for convenience, and that innovation often thrives most in places where people believe they have a stake in the outcome. In 2026, the quiet revolution of Linux desktops is no longer quiet at all. It resonates in classrooms and boardrooms, in living rooms and server farms, in the workflows of creators and the tools of professionals. It's a testament to what can happen when communities and enterprises converge around shared values and practical needs. And while the story of computing is far from finished, this chapter stands as a remarkable example of how persistence, openness, and collaboration can challenge the status quo and create something enduringly transformative.